Welcome to this session. My name is Fiona Stalker. I am a presenter and a journalist at BBC Scotland. It's an absolute pleasure to be here tonight. 2 years that shook the news. Sometimes I don't think we've got quite the bandwidth to take in everything that's happened, but over the next hour or so, we're going to have a remember everything that's kind of been happening and how that's changed the nature of news and how we do things. We're joined tonight, I'm delighted to say, by colleagues from BBC Scotland, STV, Channel 4 and Channel 5. They include broadcast journalists, a multimedia journalist and TV newsroom leaders. And they're going to be kind of reflecting on how they have navigated the past couple of years and how newsrooms have. 2 years like no other. And I will use the word unprecedented. I have overused it so much. I make no apology. Sometimes I don't think we have the vocabulary to adequately describe what it's been in terms of news of the last 2 years. Everyone will have, I think, their standout moments. The moments when you realise that you were witnessing history. And that brings with it a huge responsibility. There was a public duty to get things right. There always is, of course, but somehow I think the stakes were raised. It literally at some moments was a matter of life or death. It struck me at really odd moments of the last couple of years. I was thinking about this today, driving into the BBC some mornings during lockdown. It was almost like an apocalyptic movie. And there I was clutching that email that we got. I think that all the participants here have got, saying that you were a key worker and you were allowed to travel because you were a public service broadcaster. And there was some conflict in that. I didn't feel like a frontline worker. I wasn't working in a hospital. I wasn't working in an emergency service. I wasn't working in shops that were open to sell essential goods. But as the story of the pandemic unfolded and emerged, so did, I think, the essential nature of accurate and trusted sources of news, public health information, and the need for scrutiny in some of the decisions that affected all of our lives on a daily basis. And newsrooms, they mobilised and they adapted, and very often, of course, were hit by COVID themselves. And that was just one, albeit no doubt the dominating one, story of the last 2 years. I've not even mentioned Brexit, Black Lives Matter, COP26, a Holyrood election in the midst of a global pandemic. And more than once, as I was saying before, it was actually really difficult to almost take stock of everything that has happened over the last 2 years. On a daily basis, you were having massive news stories happen on your doorstep. And the very next day, another massive news story would happen on your doorstep. And I do wonder if perhaps some of our viewers have become slightly desensitized to big news stories, but that's something we can have a talk about. And of course, one of the things, and we were talking to my colleagues before we came on air, it was the rise of fake news. Big challenges for newsroom on that, logistical challenges. My colleague at the BBC, Mariana Spring, is the BBC's disinformation journalist. She's done a couple of panoramas around conspiracy theories. Mariana Spring gets death threats and rape threats for picking apart and exposing conspiracy theories and fake news. So this is something that we've all had to deal with in terms of fake news over the last couple of years. So we'll speak about it as well. Massive practical, logistical challenges for newsrooms, and we can speak to the newsroom leaders about that. Difficulties simply in filming during lockdown. Access safely to interviewees, and I suppose how we get round the fact that we couldn't for a long time be up close or in the same house as interviewees, a new reliance on virtual and remote interviewees. I must say, I'm in the northeast Scotland. I'm in Aberdeen tonight, where we luckily do have power. If it does go down, I'm going to nominate Alan to take over the hosting session. I'll send you my notes, Alan. But at the moment, fingers crossed, we have power. One of the programmes I present, for example, 7 Days, was immediately taken off air when it became more and more serious, the COVID situation. Myself, my co-presenters are literally on a sofa with 3 other guests. So that immediately had to go. And we had to work out how we could do programmes in a bit different way. That stayed off air until we could work out whether or not it worked with 3 remote guests. So I know that my colleagues will have to go through that as well. And then we got used to a world, didn't we, of temperature checks and daily lateral flow texts and the pingdemic rather, when we were in close contact with any of our colleagues. But as this all was happening, the audience's thirst for news was continuing to grow. And those on our panel today have been absolutely immersed in the news agenda over the past 2 years, some managing news teams from offices, others out and about in communities on the ground, gathering content. And I'm delighted they are going to be very happy to share their experiences and stories with us tonight. I'll tell you who we've got with us. My colleague Kevin Jackson's here. He's the assignment editor at BBC Scotland. Just before we come in, I'm going to let you into a secret. Kevin was just against a white wall. He's moved his camera slightly so you can just see the set of the 7, which is on air just now behind him, because he saw our STV's colleagues' backgrounds and he thought, oh, I'm going to perk mine up a bit. Linda Grimes is here, who's head of news and current affairs at STV Highlander. Ciaran Jenkins is here. You all know Ciaran, the Scotland correspondent for Channel 4 News. He gets the best design. Ciaran, I think, is just rocked up in a pub, actually. Alan Jenkins is the Scotland correspondent for Channel 5 News. And Kaye Nicolson, nice branding, is the multimedia journalist for STV. So these are my colleagues here tonight. We're going to have a chat, and then it's basically open to you guys. These guys have immense experience in television news, and the last couple of years has been challenging in many ways, and they're here to tell you about that. But please, at the end, use that time to ask them anything you want about it. We're going to have a chat for about 40 minutes. As I say, then I'm going to open the forum and put your questions into the chat box. I'll keep an eye on that, and I can direct it to whoever you want, or just put it to the panel. We're going to start, as I said, with the pandemic. Undoubtedly, the event that's had the most impact on news teams across the world continues today, and given the news of the last 48 hours will still dominate the news agenda. Practices had to change. I said that Zoom became an accepted way of doing an interview. I'm going to talk about how easy or not that was. But just before we get into the kind of meat of it, I just wanted to have a quick go round our guests and just ask perhaps the one defining moment in the pandemic that struck you, that you thought, this is incredible, this is history being made. Ciaran, I'll come to you first. Is there a moment, a standout moment for you from the pandemic?
I think the obvious one is the day it all kicked off. We were actually, a lot of us, reporting on the Alex Salmond trial, and it was the last day of that. And we were actually on another story, and there was a certain colleagues in London were getting quite frantic, and there was a sense that a lockdown was going to be introduced, and nobody really knew what that meant, and it all felt terribly apocalyptic, and we almost felt like we were on the wrong story, because this huge, enormous thing was happening to us that we all knew would be life defining, and yet we had to finish off this other job. And so it was coming home that night, and I think a lot of us probably reported on 2 stories that day. We did Alex Salmond, and we also did the announcement by the First Minister and the Prime Minister. And driving home that night almost didn't sort of sink in until I heard it replayed back at me through some other media, quite what was going to happen, and from there everything just changed.
Alan, same question to you. What was there a defining standout moment for you?
Yeah, I think mine's happened a bit later on, probably 5-6 months in actually. And what got me was we were interviewing a man, a case study, who had been in hospital for quite a while and had just come out of hospital. And normally, you know, if you're doing that kind of story, you'd be in someone's living room chatting to them about their experience. Here we were outside his house. He came to his front door. In fact, he was in a wheelchair, so he got wheeled to his front door. We did the interview on his doorstep, us at a distance, masks on. And I think for me, that was a moment where I thought, this is not usual. This is very unusual. This poor man is telling us his experience. He got very emotional, and there was no way that normally if you were with somebody, you'd be able to comfort them in some way. There was none of that. It felt very much like this is not normal, what's happening right now.
Kaye, you're nodding along there. Did you have a similar experience or a similar moment, if you like?
Yeah, there have been so many moments like that, because by the nature of a lot of the stories I do are quite sensitive, you know, human interest stories, and a lot of the time you do, obviously, sometimes you want to hug them, you usually don't, because obviously it's not very professional, but you want to kind of be close to them. So and just even as simple as kind of often wearing masks, you know, I don't think any of us realize how much we communicate with facial expressions until the pandemic hit, and suddenly we were trying to, obviously we're asking questions and communicating as part of interviews, but also you use a lot of facial expressions to kind of communicate in a non-verbal way. So that has been quite difficult. And just having that space, it feels unnatural. You're often doing interviews outdoors because obviously for so long we couldn't be indoors. So all weathers, that brings with it its own problems as well. So there were a number of moments like that. I was going to touch on, similar to what Ciaran was saying, that evening I was the same. I'd been up at the High Court in Edinburgh that day that lockdown was announced, just got in. Obviously it had been quite a frantic, full-on day. And then I got a phone call saying, you need to get to St Andrew's House now. And I don't think I'll ever forget that. It's the gravity of knowing what happened, but also in the back of your head thinking what that means personally, for all of us. Absolutely. And that was the strange thing. It was that kind of dichotomy between the two, personal and the professional.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Linda, you were sort of like Kevin is, you were, overseeing news teams. So from that point of view, was the moment for you that you won't forget?
I think for me, it was actually watching the virus travel across the globe, and you knew it was coming, and we just didn't know how hard it was going to hit. So while our journalists were out gathering the news, I had this sense that we were about to experience something that I really didn't know how we were going to get through it. And for me, the moment came actually watching colleagues in London reporting. They were just like the curve was just ahead in England, and actually watching stories of people in their 40s being ventilated, people beginning to die. And one story really stands out was the nurse who died in the very sort of early days of COVID, and someone had spat at her. And I just thought, this is terrible, and this is coming our way. So my thoughts were really twofold. One, for my own staff, how were we going to protect our staff? How were they physically going to work when inevitably lockdown came? And when it came very, very quick and very, very suddenly. How were they going to be equipped to deal with the scale of what was about to happen? We were experienced journalists, but I knew that the scale was going to be, you said earlier, Fiona, unprecedented. And we absolutely didn't know what was coming next,
No, we had no template at all.
No, and I mean, very good point. There was no rule book in this.
No.
So you had to respond and react minute by minute, hour by hour. And we had to protect the news. Our very job is to go out, and we were being told, don't go out, stay protected. But we really had to do two things. One, our staff, first and foremost, and actually get out and get the news.
Kevin, from your point of view, you're an assignment editor at the BBC. So from my point of view, you're head of herding cats, because I don't know how you do it sometimes. We're often in all sorts of directions, and you're basically the anchor there, who you've just emerged from COP26. But from a pandemic point of view, as Linda was saying, no template, completely unprecedented. Was there a moment for you that stands out from the early days?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone else has kind of mentioned the key ones in that moment. The PM stood up and said the whole country's in lockdown. But for me, like Alan, it happened kind of a few weeks later. Obviously, hospitals and ICU departments were kind of overrun, and that's where the kind of the worst of the pandemic was seen. So we spent weeks trying to get access to ICU and filling out risk assessments and making sure that our staff could go in safely to see what was happening within the kind of ICU departments. But for me, the kind of key moment was as a viewer, when you kind of watch the programme and you see the pictures inside the ICU, you kind of get the interviews with the doctors and nurses, and you get a real sense that this is a crisis. This is such a massive event that's got a real effect on real people. It's got a real effect on the staff that work in the hospitals. And I think that's kind of how it kind of crystallised for me, is that this is a big deal. And at the other end of that is the first patient who was clapped out of a hospital. So you had those pictures of the guard of honour of the nurses. And you think that person has survived. Yeah. They've come through this kind of pain, and the nurse, you could see the emotion in the doctors and nurses at both stages, that they were trying to save lives, and then at the end they'd actually done their job. That for me was the kind of bookend of the kind of the importance and the kind of ferocity of the event, that we could show those pictures. to the audience.
That seems such a long time ago. I was just thinking about clap for carer seems like literally a different lifetime. And Ciaran, after that massive life-changing announcement was made, your job, obviously, you were out and about every day covering it. What were those first few weeks like? How did that feel straight after that big announcement?
They were pretty terrifying from a personal point of view, because we watch the news as well as make it. You were worried for the safety of yourself and your family, but also, I mean, from speaking as a journalist, it's an incredible responsibility, because here we are in Scotland with the biggest story in the world unfolding right in front of us, and our job is to tell it, to unearth what is going on. We very quickly settled on looking at care homes, because we detected a lot of focus on what was happening in Scotland in hospitals, and not so much perhaps on care homes. And so we brought in a care home, which we followed from before the pandemic hit, right the way through the pandemic. And we were able to see, they filmed themselves inside for us so that we wouldn't go in and expose them in any way. But the really horrifying impact of this virus on a care home, where eventually people passed away. They were begging for help, they were begging for PPE, and what that provided us as well was a way in to some of the sort of political vulnerabilities of the pandemic, where perhaps the political rhetoric didn't match up to the reality on the ground, and we were able to show people the reality on the ground, and it was terrifying.
And how much do you think that will be remembered as one of the legacies of the pandemic, is what happened in the care homes? Do you think that will be one of the parts of history that will stay in people's minds because of public service broadcasting?
Without a doubt. We all know the phrase about the protective ring around care homes. We all know how far that was, in truth, from the reality that carers were facing. We all know the absence of PPE and testing, and people weren't clapped out of care homes, and also the emotional side of that story was so pronounced, because in hospitals, nurses and doctors may meet their patients, for a few hours as they're treating them, but in care homes, they have this incredibly personal relationship with the people they're looking after, and they were losing them on a scale that they could never have imagined. Every single care home, it was like they were dealing with their own disaster.
Alan, you're part of a programme like Ciaran, obviously delivering UK news. Your role would have become key in that Scotland was doing things differently at certain points. There was different messaging from the Scottish government, the UK government. That must have been a challenge, and also a very important message to get across of the differences.
Yeah, my role changed quite a bit. I'd been in post about a year, just and then the pandemic hit. And before that point, I'd been doing stories from Scotland, but there were days where I would do a UK story from Scotland. All of a sudden, the focus was like, what can you do for us, from north of the border? And I think that was really important, as you touched on there. As governments chose to make different decisions and took different steps, it became very important to have somebody who was outside of England, for example, talking through what this would mean for people. So from a public, interest point of view, as a responsibility, it was important for our Scottish viewers that I was outlining the changes up here, but for viewers in England, it allowed them to see how things were being done differently. And I think it really brought up, devolution for a lot of people in England. It doesn't really mean anything to them. All of a sudden, this was, oh, hang on, a country's doing something differently. And whether it's the right or wrong reason, it allowed people to start to question the decisions that governments were making and look at the decisions being made by politicians.
In what ways did you have to change the way you reported? You're a multimedia journalist. When you're out and about and news gathering, how did that change in the first wee while? And what changes are still there for you?
It changed drastically, to be honest. I mean, usually I'm not sitting stealing Kellyanne's chair in this cozy studio. I usually am out and about all over the place. But usually we're based in the office, we're deployed from the office every day. I'm based in Edinburgh, and there's obviously teams across the country. But the week before lockdown, we were working from home. That was the decision was made. We were going to start from home, be deployed from home. All our morning meetings went to Zoom. And thankfully, we all, as MMJs, multimedia journalists, we all had our own camera kits and laptops with editing software, which was actually a bit of a lifesaver. I'm not really sure how we would have coped without it. So we were, you know, all editing from our flats, from our homes, trying to do what we could to do things remotely. So it was really unusual, but in lots of ways you might not think about. For example, you're used to being in a kind of collaborative environment with other journalists around. You can bounce ideas off. It's not the same when you're sitting in your kitchen on Zoom, you know. And also, as Ciaran touched on, you know, trying to get contributors to suddenly almost become video journalists as well. People you were interviewing, trying to explain to them, well, would you mind getting a couple of what we call setup shots, get your phone, put it in landscape, get a couple of different angles so we can create a sequence, because we're trying to avoid going out and putting other people at risk. And just to kind of follow on from that as well, obviously we weren't, if we did have a camera operator with us, we weren't able to travel together. So it's all these kind of behind the scenes things that might sound quite straightforward, but actually it's the logistics of 2 cars, trying to figure out where you're meeting, and then being at a distance, not being able to bounce ideas off each other again. It was a lot of the kind of logistical side of things. You had to really think on your feet even more so than usual.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in? Sorry, just one thing I want to add as well. I think it's important to mention this, the personal, because as Kaye touched on there, we're used to collaborating, being with other people. All of a sudden, you are often on your own, and it's very rare that reporters would be living the story that they're reporting on.
Yes.
And actually, mentally, that was quite tough at times. I'll be very honest about that. I live on my own. I was coming home after covering COVID all day, and I was thinking about COVID. I was watching the news programs about COVID, and it was a real struggle. And I think there'll be a lot of journalists across the world that would feel the same way. We're not frontline workers, we're not, but we've had to deal with this in a different way as well.
No, I think that's a very good point. I was very, very, very lucky in that I was going into work right from the start, so to present drive time, etc. So I was in work, and it was easier to be in work, and it was a safe environment, but it was easier to be with people who you could bounce off stuff, or you could just, you know, you could be upset with, and that was fine. But I think being isolated and working from home must have been really hard. Kevin, you were dealing with a lot of these logistical issues. You were getting phone calls from us, you know, checking about filming setups and how far we had to be outside and mask wearing, all the rest of it. Viewers, I think, are much more accepting of Zoom interviews now, and dare I say it, reduced quality, because it is sometimes. Do you think in a way it opens up the pool of people in some ways about who you can have on your programs? Is that one of the good things maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of positives and negatives of kind of this kind of environment that we're all in just now. I think there's no doubt at the beginning of lockdown, it opened up the whole world to contributors. In Scotland, we could speak to people in England, we could speak to people abroad, we could speak to people all over. So it did open up the possibilities of speaking to other contributors. But you lose that personal touch, you lose that ability to debate and to discuss and to kind of assess body language and kind of facial expressions and everything else on Zoom. So I think you lost what you gained when you kind of moved to Zoom. In terms of newsrooms, and again, in the kind of behind the scenes, Zooms became the kind of glue that kept a lot of the newsrooms together. Sessions like this is where we had the editorial meetings in the mornings and the forward planning in the afternoon. All editorial discussions came to Zoom. So we were all in this format, trying to debate stories and trying to agree with each other, trying to disagree with each other, trying to bring everybody in. And that's the only way we could do it. And I think even now it's part of our daily routine still. So we've kind of got the best of it, I think, but there's no substitute for going to somebody's house and speaking to them in person and getting to know them and kind of making them feel at ease before presented with the interviewer or going through all the different topics. So I think it's a necessary evil that's got, I think the positives are there, but yeah, I'm looking forward to getting back to kind of normal life where you can speak to real people in real life.
Sorry, Kaye, you want to speak there?
I was just going to jump in to say that an interesting thing we've noticed is particularly kind of female contributors or people who live very remotely have commented on how great it is. They suddenly feel like they are more accessible as interviewees, you know, particularly if there's childcare responsibilities or they can't really get to, you know, used to be quite almost restrictive that we had to say, well, where are you? We'll come to you, but it needs to be within reason, you know, wherever our crew is. But that has been a positive in some ways.
Linda,
can I just pick up just on the positives? I think, you know, we were hugely inventive in that time and hugely creative. Now you are faced with this real terrible uncertainty, but you know, we accelerated so much change that would have taken us, frankly, months. I mean, one good story would be, you know, our political editor, he became the editor in the attic in the early days, you know, Colin Mackay, I don't know if he's on the line, probably isn't, probably making his tea right now. You know, Colin would say himself, you know, I don't know how to use Skype, I'm not sure I'd pick this up. Within literally days, he was like, look, I'm here. I've already been at the First Minister's office. You know, all the ministers were at home. He was passing information. He was able to broadcast from his home. This was really, really important stuff to us in those early days. You know, one of the programs that we made was the clinical director, Jason Leach, on Scotland Tonight in our primetime slot. And we said, look, we really want to get this program on air. What do? We want people to be able to ask him questions. So it was as simple as, look, Jason, can you be in your garden for the entire half hour? Yes, was the answer. We couldn't have him in the studio. Our presenter was in the studio, and there, you know, our viewers were using WhatsApp to send in the questions on little videos to him. I mean, you know, we were getting through this stuff, you know, within a matter of hours. And, you know, that was something very sort of democratic that the technology brought with it. And to Kaye's point, opening up to people in their own homes. We've stayed with that format, you know, on Scotland Tonight. Again, we have, you know, our Talking Heads section on our primetime programme and our panel debates on our Monday evenings, and people join us from home, and that's great. You know, we don't all have to be in the studio to debate. So, you know, positives come from it, and we relied really on this brilliant staff who were there, you know, really putting their minds and putting their shifts in to get us through it in those very early days.
Indeed, I really, really, really miss the face-to-face and the body language and that, like you were saying, Kaye. I just think it's so important, and I'm personally, you know, delighted that there's an element of that back now. Just to see the body language helps, doesn't it, and to put people at ease and all the rest of it. We could talk about the pandemic for hours, but there have been other giant events. God, was it 2 weeks ago? COP26 right on our doorstep in Glasgow. Over 100 world leaders descending on the city in the midst of a global pandemic. Quite a challenge for news teams. Kevin, first of all, international news delivered obviously at a local level. How did, because I know you were deeply immersed in this, how did newsrooms prepare for such an event?
I think the planning of COP26 aged me about 20 years.
You had hair about 6 months ago.
I had full hair down to my shoulders. It was just such a massive event. I think it was so massively trailed in advance because it was obviously supposed to be 2020. It got delayed because of the pandemic. And the rhetoric beforehand really ramped up with the sound bites, last chance to save the planet, and Glasgow will kind of save the world type stuff. So the stakes were really high. I think logistically it was tricky. I think we were all kind of preparing for a Glasgow that was locked down. We were preparing for traffic chaos, protests, and everything else. It probably didn't quite happen as much as we thought it would. But in terms of kind of getting people together, it was massive. We were kind of planning the arrival of President of the United States, of the Queen and the Pope at some point. Up to 100,000 protesters. So we had to kind of plan quite carefully where we would be for all those individual events. It was always in the middle of the pandemic, so people were kind of working from home as they were during the pandemic, and just deploying people out and about was made more difficult. And I think somebody touched on it earlier. I think the resilience of the staff that actually just turned out to cover this story was amazing. We had kind of world leaders across the river. We had everyday protesters. It's getting the right balance between the two. It was quite tricky to get. I think collectively we all kind of pulled it off. I think one of the main difficulties was trying to make it relevant to a kind of Glasgow audience or a Scottish audience. Climate change is such a huge issue that getting voices from outside Glasgow was quite crucial. So we frequently went to Aberdeen or to Stornoway or to elsewhere in Scotland just to ask people what they thought of climate change, what they thought of COP, what they thought it was doing. And generally people were positive. People were kind of accepting that this is a big moment that everyone can play their part. So I think in terms of kind of logistically, we kind of just made sure all the right people were in the right places, and just reacted to what was happening. I mean, the protest on the Saturday in the middle of 100,000 people going through Glasgow was huge. It was such a huge event. We had like 5 teams, I think, covering it from beginning to end, just to get the colour and get what was happening. So yeah, it was huge. It was just a huge event.
I'm going to come to you in a second, Linda, but Ciaran, you were in Glasgow, weren't you, for the whole event? Channel 4 had its own studio. What was that experience like?
It was terrific, actually. You introduced our office here as a bar. Not quite that fortunate, although there are bars nearby. We built a pop-up platform, which became a covered studio on the top of our building with views out for the Glasgow skyline, which looked fantastic. And that went up just a few weeks. We had 2 other live points in the city as well. So 3 different presentation points for Channel 4 News in Glasgow, and various different colleagues and presenter colleagues coming up as well. And you know, for a couple of weeks, we were the biggest story in town, weren't we? And it's, as a journalist, it's what you want to be doing. Quite how successful we all were, I'm not entirely sure, because I think if you ask the general public now what the outcome of COP26 was, you might get some interesting answers. But maybe that's not our fault. Maybe that's you know, the organisers' fault, or the diplomats or the politicians.
Indeed. Linda, what was preparations like for you?
I mean, I think it's similar to Kevin. We planned it like a military operation, and you know, we all love these big events as journalists. I think what Ciaran, actually, to pick up on, we had a wonderful spot, a bit like yourself, Ciaran, overlooking the whole of COP, and you could actually see, you know, snipers on the roofs of hotels round about, you know, and there was this sort of real buzz and this real excitement. How do you relate a story on such a global scale to an audience right in your doorstep? That was always going to be the challenge. And, you know, in the STV, people were, our natural audience, were very interested in, you know, the arrival of presidents to pop stars, you know, to the local impact, road closures, to, you know, the talk of protest. But, you know, I think, you know, on reflection, it has to go and will go wider. I think too often climate is represented as something that's happening much more dramatically in other bits of the world. And that is true. That is true. But COP, I believe, made us think much more about how issues relate to our lives here. The jobs, you know, transitions to renewables, making our transport sustainable. We use buses, we use trains. How are we going to heat our homes? Thinking about our own environments, the land, but our environments of our inner cities. And that goes to politics, it goes to health, and it goes to equalities, and it goes to inequalities. So for me, there will be a lasting impact of COP. We've got our, you know, our COP, our correspondent, our climate correspondent at STV. And we had a bit of a secret weapon. We used our meteorologist Sean Batty to actually cut through a lot of what was being discussed, and made it, you know, really relatable to our audience. And we all have different audiences. Channel 4 has a different audience from, you know, STV as BBC, and that's all really important when we are covering an event of this scale and importance.
Alan, that's a challenge though, isn't it? How do you engage your audience with something like climate change? I mean, it was on our minds constantly, wasn't it? How do I make this relevant?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Just to pick up quickly on what Kevin said, I think he called it logistically tricky. I call it a logistical nightmare, because you know, some of you guys may have teams that were there. It was just myself and my shoot edit. So every day we were carrying kit about 3 miles, because the media centre was as far as you could go in the venue. It's like it was planned that way, to make you walk, and you had to queue up every day. You had to think way ahead of, well, we need to be inside, but then there's an interview outside in an hour. So do we go inside? Do we wait? It took up a lot of headspace. And then on top of it, it was telling the story. For us, we made a decision very early on that we would do a lot of pre-shoots before and a lot of pre-filming, and to make it as visual as possible. So, you know, at one point I was up inside a mountain where there was a hydropower station. You know, we were trying to find ways to make it visually engaging to tell the story, because we knew that ultimately it's a conference, and conferences don't tend to be that visually stimulating and usually not very interesting. And so we made a big point in trying to make it as visual and as fun at times as we could. I mean, it's hard to do that, but, you know, at one point I was live on a bouncy castle. So, you know, there are ways
to make flip to show. Alan.
I actually did put, when you bounced, the air was pushed to algae, and algae created oxygen. So there was a reason for it. But you know, it was trying to engage an audience and make pieces stand out and make them take notice.
I love that idea. I love that. I'm going to Google that next. Kaye, I was going to ask you about, I wanted to talk about, I realise we've got so much to talk about, but talk about trust in broadcasters. And I think the pandemic has taught all of us that audiences do trust the broadcasters. They rely on familiar brands, familiar faces like you guys. Do you encounter, for example, any hostility when you're out and about, or any on social media? Because I'm very aware that most of us will have had some difficulties on social media. And, you know, as soon as I'm on Good Morning Scotland, you have various comments come in questioning your interview or all the rest of it. How do you deal with it? And have you noticed an increase in that during the last 2 years?
In some ways, yes. I don't cover very much of the political side of things. So I think in some ways I have, you know, I have avoided some of the vitriol that a lot of my colleagues have had. I mean, some of my colleagues are getting abuse on a regular basis. I know Catherine Sampson, our Westminster correspondent, has spoken about, you know, some of the tweets she gets when she's been doing lives from Westminster. But what I would say is that I think everything has become more polarized. It goes down from politics or lockdown, you know, maybe the anti-vax movement, but even more kind of low-level discussions and themes. I think people are just a little bit more black and white about their views, and perhaps particularly when they're sitting behind a keyboard and they feel more confident in saying whatever that comes to their mind. I actually noticed today STV had retweeted RTS about tonight's event, and I saw within about 5-10 minutes we got a reply from someone saying political bias and centralisation. And so that's just a prime example. It's just some random kind of troll on Twitter with nothing else. That's just what she's written. So it's the kind of thing we're getting a lot. But on a kind of more low level side of things, one thing I was going to say, I think one of the stories I've had the most abuse on was something about transport in Edinburgh. But it was a debate that had become so polarised about these kind of spaces for people, you know, changing the road layout, that some of the abuse and just the kind of anger and you know, people kind of need to get a bit of perspective sometimes. But I think overall it does seem like there's, you know, across all sorts of themes, be it topics that seem kind of quite innocuous, people particularly online are just very black and white on their views. There's not as much nuance anymore, I think, in kind of public debate.
It's the nuance, isn't it? I get the most abuse when I call an Aberdeen Rowie a Rowie, because some people like to call it a buttery.
I do, but I won't troll you about it. I call it a
Thank you very much. Yeah, it was mad. Ciaran, research shows a lot of people are now getting, particularly younger people, are getting their news from social media, and they trust that social media. How do you stay relevant for younger audiences? We all talk about that as broadcasters, but how can we tackle that? Because social media is not regulated in the same way as broadcasters are they?
I think ultimately you've got to have faith in your journalism. And sometimes I think we do young people a disservice because if anything, COP showed how engaged young people are with issues that matter to them. And actually, young people were probably ahead of a lot of the media and certainly a lot of politicians in terms of recognizing climate change as the defining issue of our era. So we should give them a bit of credit for that. So perhaps we needed to be more aware of the issues they were interested in and tailoring that content to them a little sooner than we were. And if we do that, and if we continue to deliver genuinely original news, that sheds light on the world as they see it, then I don't think we've got an awful lot to worry about, because I think there's a thirst for that, even in some of the darker reaches of the internet. And it will always cut through. We were all very despairing a few years ago, thinking that we would all be swamped by this ocean of disinformation, and actually I think what we saw over in the States and the rest of it over the past few years was a real hunger for information. So it's our job really is to be ahead of the tide and to make sure people know what's going on in the world, and that means it is the hard slog of original journalism, I think.
Kevin, do you share Ciaran's optimism?
Yeah, I think so. I think Ciaran hit the nail on the head there. I think a couple of years ago we were all kind of worried about what social media would do and how it would change the landscape that we all work in. But actually the strength of all of our brands and of the public service broadcasters in general is that we are trusted. We've got kind of mechanisms in place to govern our own impartiality and bias and everything else. So I think the challenge for us is to kind of shout as loud as those parts of the darker parts of the internet that might be spreading misinformation or fake news or everything else, and give people the facts in a kind of balanced way. I think that's what we all do kind of really well. I think we just have to meet that head on. I think it's unfortunate that certain individuals will be targeted depending on politics and everything else. I think we have to support staff through that, again, as kind of leaders in the newsrooms. But I think empowering everybody to combat the noise with accurate information and a balanced viewpoint, as Ciaran says, will cut through. I mean, young people, old people, different kind of groups will kind of come to that and trust what we're telling them.
And Linda, as Kevin says, there's a lot of noise, hasn't there? And, there has been from public figures like Donald Trump, Nigel Farage, who have been vocally hostile to broadcasters and to mainstream media. Do you think that's had an impact on newsrooms or trust in familiar brands or not?
Well, I mean, this all really comes down to, trust. And I think public service broadcasters can really cut through, any unchecked rumour that pervades just some parts of social media, some unregulated website. And what Ciaran said, I think we've got to give people credit. I think we could see through when the former president of America was suggesting that maybe, some disinfectant, injected in would maybe wipe out this virus. That's when people were searching for real, strong, good information. And that's when engagement for, social media and for the digital space, public service broadcasters occupy. That's where we really got our engagement. And I think all during the pandemic, we saw our audiences grow, not just online, but on broadcast, and people really do want to engage. So, I'm not someone that takes this with any complacency. We need to be in that space, and we need to, remain certainly relevant, of course, on broadcast, but absolutely on digital. And that's the challenge that we have as broadcasters going forward.
Just a time, I do want to talk about another couple of things. Diversity and inclusion is absolutely rightly in the spotlight at the moment. I just want to know what Scotland's broadcasters are doing to ensure fair and balanced representation on screens. I was going to go to back to you, Linda. What's STV doing?
Oh, we're taking this really seriously. What I would say was that, our work on diversity and inclusion has been ongoing, but really it was the heinous killing of George Floyd that really did make us really stop and think. We took a long, hard look at what we were doing, even within our own company, and look at both our on-screen representations and in our workforce. And although I would say that our work at that point was encouraging, it just really wasn't going far enough, and most importantly, not far enough for people, seeking that representation and coming through into the industry. So we set targets. I mean, similarly, the BBC do have targets. It was the first time that we really did set targets. So our targets are in news. We gave a commitment that 8% of our contributors would come from a Black and minority ethnic background. And in current affairs, we put that at 12%. And they're stretching targets. And also on gender, we're signed up for the 50-50 project. So we're working very hard to ensure that contributors across news and current affairs sits at 50-50. Now that might sound easy on the 50-50 because half the population are women. It's not when you consider that in very many leadership positions, it's men, and they're naturally being put forward for interview, and also other reasons that we often know where women don't put themselves forward as much. So,
and that's interesting, they don't. And I've come across this, and it'd be interesting to see what Kaye, Alan and Ciaran think, is if you now this is a huge generalisation, if you'll ask a guy if he'll go and do a tele interview, he'll probably say yes. A woman will go, no, I don't think I can do that. And that happens time and time again. And it's a difficult one to tackle. And I have female contributors who are superb on radio, and they are hesitant to do it on telly because they lack that confidence. Guys, and again I'm generalizing, tend to go, I can do that, yeah, I'll do it on telly. I don't know, you share the same thoughts?
Oh yes.
Okay, yeah, what do you think?
Very, very much so. I agree with you. And one thing we're trying to combat that actually at STV as well, we're doing a course called Expert Voices. So we're running a series of, again, kind of Zoom events, but they've been really well received because I think we're just kind of myth busting it's not as scary as it sounds. And time again that comes up. It's women only that we're doing these kind of mini courses, and so many of them say, oh, we all just sell ourselves short. I think, again, generalization, but more often than not, and perhaps more concerned about appearance or pushback online. There's been concerns about that raised as well. So it's just about kind of trying to arm everyone with the skills that it's not quite as scary as it looks, and that we should all kind of build each other up as well, and provide that community to kind of support other women as well, and just put ourselves forward more.
Kevin, excuse me, what's BBC doing diversity and inclusion wise?
So, like Linda mentioned, the BBC have got kind of specific targets to try, and I think that there's kind of two prongs to it. There's the workforce. BBC's obviously got a huge workforce, and the BBC have got the same targets to have kind of 50% gender balance, 20% minorities, and 12% disabilities. So there's a big drive to make sure that the workforce and the people that make the programmes represent the audiences that they're trying to serve. So I think that's like kind of the big drive at the moment, is that when we're all sitting in newsrooms making decisions on stories based on our own backgrounds and our own experiences, some of them are quite similar. So I think to have a diversity of workforce and people in the room with different experiences, different kind of life kind of cultures and everything else, I think that's a key thing to making different output. It will be reflected in the stories we tell, it will be reflected in the case studies that are chosen. So that's a kind of big driver from the kind of the BBC as a whole. There's also kind of, I'm on a course tomorrow, in fact, a kind of senior leadership course in kind of making sure that we're creating an environment where people want to work. That's an inclusive environment, that no matter what people's background, no matter what their cultures are, they want to come and work for the BBC, and they want to come and kind of make programmes. And again, I'm sure the other broadcasters are the same. It's to create that environment just to make sure that people kind of are happy and content, because that's when you get the good content. So I think it's a 3-year programme that over the next 3 years are trying to kind of make that kind of workforce as diverse as the population.
Very happy to take any questions at this point from the audience. Just bung them into the Q&A box. Alan, and I'll come to Ciaran in a sec. How does your organisation's approach to diversity and inclusion kind of impact you on a daily basis? What are you aware of?
Well, it's like if I'm putting together a piece, but then I'll potentially have 3 voices in there, and I'll look and go, these are all white men. You know, that's not accurate. It doesn't represent our viewers. So there's a lot of the time where press officers would say, do you have a female professor that could talk about this? You know, to make the same point. And so it does inform us way more than I maybe used to. And I'm always super aware when we are, you know, planning the story for the next day, or, you know, deciding what the story is that day, that we are representing the audience, that we are catering for them.
Ciaran, same question to you. How does it impact, and how difficult is it, or not?
Well, I don't think we need any more reporters called Jenkins in Scotland. We're represented, even though only one of us is a proper Welshman.
Oh,
but you know, it's. I mean, Kevin mentioned upbringing. You know, my upbringing is very important to me in the sort of stories that I go out and look for, because I grew up in an area that wasn't particularly advantaged. It was pretty disadvantaged, and so it's natural for me to look for those stories in communities that people tend to overlook. And it's part of the DNA of Channel 4 to go out and search for voices that are unheard and underrepresented. So we feel that very strongly. I think in recent years, you're right, that there haven't been enough women in television, interviewed in television news pieces. And you know, we'd be quite ruthless about it. We will Alan requests, maybe we demand a female voice, because, you know, and the pandemic has shown that there's some incredible, you know, voices in Scotland that we didn't know about before, and now they're sort of household names, and it's a wonderful.
Aren't they? Yeah, amazing. I mean, the female scientific community is just incredible, isn't it? I've always found it a challenge, and I guess the reporters here will, of that in the oil and gas industry in the northeast of Scotland. That's taken quite some time to bring to the fore some of the females who will talk to us in the oil and gas industry. So that's a big challenge. Just briefly, I think it's important to touch on, because there are media students who are with us tonight, and when it's onto YouTube, I'm sure there'll be more. But I do think it's important just to go into how to get that important first step up onto the ladder. Ciaran, first of all, you're talking to a room of media students. What do you say to them? What do they need to do to be the Scotland correspondent for Channel 4 News?
Well, get rid of me.
Jenkins, yeah.
Offer me a great job somewhere, I'll take it. The main thing that you should do is look at the world around you, because that's the world that you understand best and probably understand better than people like me. And in that world, there are heaps and heaps and heaps of stories. You just need to go and find them. Find something that interests you, find something that seems a bit odd, out of place, and pursue it. And I'd say the thing that sets you apart as a young aspiring journalist is to have that track record, a portfolio of work, show that you can go and find a story. You know, there's no excuse not to broadcast it anywhere these days. You've got all sorts of platforms to do it. So go out, find the story, do it. Don't wait for anyone to hand it to you on a plate.
Every single word of that. Alan, what would you say? What would you add to that?
Exactly what Ciaran said. I will also add,
what Ciaran said.
This might sound really, really simple, but be nice. Because there's this, there are plenty of egos around, trust me, I've met many of them. And there's this perception that you have to be cutthroat to do well in broadcast TV. And that's nonsense. Because I think, especially in Scotland, we all know each other, right? Everyone knows everybody and people talk. So if you're difficult to work with, if you're not that pleasant, people will hear about it. So be nice. And that actually will flow through into your storytelling as well when you're interviewing people. You know, people will open up to you. If you're a nice person and you're decent, they'll sense that, and you'll probably get a better story out of it as well.
And Ciaran's so nice. He's just invited us all to have drinks at his Channel 4 bar at some point.
We're definitely holding on to that as well.
Pay for them, though.
Such a nice man. Kate, what would you add to that? What would your thoughts be?
Work experience. Get as much of it in all forms of journalism as you possibly can. I mean, as a teenager, I did everything from working at the Forest Gazette, my local paper in the Northeast, to doing kind of sub-editing for an oil and gas kind of online website. You know, I didn't have that much interest in oil and gas, if I'm honest, at that point, but I knew it was going to stand me in good stead. And I just think it really does set you apart. And my first job as a journalist was at the Press and Journal in Elgin, and that came out of a week of work experience in the Aberdeen office. I can't really stress that enough. It's just, it sets you apart because it gives you that grounding, and you can see how news works. I would also say, which is something that I have kind of learned over the last 10, 12 years, is don't worry about pigeonholing yourself too much. You know, if you have started out in one form of the media, that doesn't mean you can't cross over. You know, I did newspapers, then I went into digital at STV before I moved over to broadcast, and ultimately the journalism skills are the same. That grounding is there, and is getting that foot in the door. The core of it. Yes, doing everything from, you know,
finding the
stories, covering court, covering a royal visit. You know, it could be anything in between, and those kind of local grounding can be really, really crucial. You learn so much. It's kind of invaluable.
I've got some questions coming. I'm going to rattle through a couple of these. Ruth says, Alan spoke earlier about how difficult it was to report and live through the pandemic while living alone. I'm sure journalists are not. People in newsrooms will understand that feeling. At what point for the panelists did that all start to become slightly less heavy? So, Alan, you were working alone. Is it eased at all?
Yeah, it has. I think, well, we got used to it, which, you know, becomes the new norm, doesn't it? That phrase, the new norm. And it did become, after a few months, it became just okay, this is how we deal with it. And I have to say, I've got a great colleague. We work, at times it's like we're a married couple, but I have a shoot edit that I work with all the time. And we became, at one point, when it eased a little bit, we became essentially a bubble in ourselves. So we could do things like, because we would often travel long distances. So it was just impractical. So we bubbled up essentially, and that helped for me anyway.
I'm going to ask, probably time for one more question, unfortunately. Talking of diversity, Leon says, how does that impact age? How is each organisation's relationship in new talent in the studio and the talent scheme, etc.? That's maybe one for Kevin and Linda. Kevin, in terms of new talent, getting new talent in.
I mean, again, I think the BBC have got quite a lot of apprenticeship schemes that are actually really useful, and quite a lot of people you see on air nowadays have come through either the journalism apprenticeship or the production one. There's an engineering one and another scheme, and these are great ways of getting the experience that Kaye spoke about. Is actually getting the experience of all of the different parts of the kind of broadcasting kind of landscape. I mean, if you know, you kind of go between radio and telly, you've got there's online, there's producers behind the scenes, there's cameramen that Alan mentioned, there's shoot edits, there's so many different parts to do. I think that's the key, is actually working out maybe what you want to start off doing through apprenticeship, through work experience, applying for jobs, and then work your way through the system. I think there's no one kind of surefire way to get into the industry. I think it's just a collection of everything, but it's that kind of being nice and that kind of dogged determinism just to keep following up, and don't be disheartened if you don't get a particular role, or you don't get into a particular kind of thing that you want to get into. I think it's just keep trying.
You persevere, don't you, Linda? What's
I would kind of echo all of it. That you'll probably think, well, I want something a bit more specific. You can get in. I got in. Everyone on this call get in. I was from a big working class area. And I came into the industry. I got in because I persevered, and I got a foot in the door. And at the interview, I talked a lot about like what I was just interested in. Be passionate. Have a passion. Have a passion in people was what I would always say. And if you don't get in the first time, try again. Come back through. It is competitive. I'm not going to say it's easy. It can be challenging. If you can get in, that's when you will really you'll make that difference. Upskilling is so important. You can take your phone out and you can make a story. Watch your social media feeds. We all look at them. See, when you go for that interview, we go and peek on them and we see what's great and we see what's not so good. So be aware of yourself, be aware of others. And we have similar schemes coming through. It has been more challenging because of COVID and the pandemic, and less people moving on, less openings. I talk a lot to hiring managers about how you're going to hire, what's the next stream of journalists coming through. So a lot of work on mentoring from, when people do get in, and mentoring, externally, hugely important, particularly for women coming through, hugely important for women moving on and up and through their careers too. Often, I would say to people, when you're interviewing for people, find someone that's going to tell you something new. There's lots and lots and lots that I don't know. I mean, I'm sure Kaye, who knows me well, and Alan, who also knows me, will tell you that. There's lots I don't know. We don't know everything. So, go in, be passionate, be knowledgeable. And I think Ciaran's advice was very good about, know yourself, work to your difference. Being different can be good. You will stand out, and work hard.
Final word from the panelists, because we're just about to crash 8 o'clock. We hate to do that. We hate to crash the top of the news. Ciaran, in terms of the future broadcast news, how optimistic are you about the future?
Well, I'm very optimistic because I see the potential for new audiences, and there has never been probably a more important time to be a journalist. I just, the last 2 years tells us that we've been through some absolutely astonishing things that none of us ever imagined we'd live through. And if that's just the last 2 years, what the next few are going to be like?
Alan, thoughts?
Yeah, the pandemic's highlighted just how important news is and how it's valued by people at times when they really need information. So, yeah.
Okay.
I think we've all shown that we can punch above our weight, even in the most trying of circumstances. So I am optimistic, because I think if we can adapt as quickly as we did to lockdown and everything that came after, then we can adapt to the changing environment. And obviously we've got some great mediums and lots of fantastic video content, which can also be used on social media as well. So we just need to be more creative about that.
Sorry to interrupt. Kevin?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there's lots of reasons to be optimistic. I mean, I come into work every day, and pretty much everybody I work with wants to tell stories, wants to reach out to different audiences on different subjects. There's so much scope out there. And I think it's a reason to be positive about the future, and whatever medium survives the next 10, 20 years, I think the talent and the skills are there to deliver on it. So yeah, I think we should be kind of confident that we'll all still be here in 10 years.
Linda?
I'd say the best days of news are always in front of us.
Nice. Well, we'll end on that note. Thank you so much to our panel. Thank you to Kevin, Linda, Kaye, Alan and Ciaran. Very much appreciated. Royal Television Society of Scotland will be putting this on their YouTube channel, so you can check that if you want to watch that back and take any tips from that. It has been an absolute joy speaking to you all tonight. Thank you to our panel. Thank you to you guys that have joined us tonight, and stay safe and keep at it. Thank you very much. Have a good night, everyone.